Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Today I'm speaking with Dennis Patrick Slattery. So welcome, Dennis.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
Dennis, we've chatted before, and I'll just give a brief bio. You're Emeritus Professor of Pacifica Graduate Institute. You're the author of many books, The Way of Myth, A Limbo of Shards, Deep Creativity, a book on the Odyssey. And today we are speaking about the poetic base of mind. And I think that's something that was coined by Hillman.
Yes.
And I was just thinking, when I woke up this morning, Dennis, I was thinking, you know, one thing about Hillman I've always liked is if you're a little, literary inclined, is that he's mentioned so many things that have stuck in my mind. Like when he says the psyche is a boarding house, or he likes to imagine the psyche as a boarding house, it stayed with me. Or Jung opened the mouth of the dead. Or one other that's always stayed with me is how he said even Hercules had to spin and weave his female soul or whatever. So it's kind of like with Hillman, rather than just that kind of dry, formal analysis, he takes you into that poetic richness or something. And
right. Yeah, exactly right. A quote that I wrote down that I was reading today, and I love this because it's so pertinent to our conversation today. Every notion in our minds, every perception in the world must go through a psychic organization in order to happen at all. And maybe that I'm going to add that to your list of things. It must go through a psychic organization in order to happen at all. I mean, when I read that, I thought, I've got to get this down and share it when John and I get together.
yeah.
And that's implicit there. That psychic organization, I think, is another way of speaking about it must go through a mythology. It must be mythically inflected in order to happen at all. So I'm going to, there are many places where I'm going to take liberties with Jim because I don't want to Xerox him. I want to bring in what did he make me think about, as I read him.
Well, maybe let's back up one second, because, when we last spoke and you were speaking about stumbling across Jung and then how you got to Pacifica and all that, let me just ask you as a way of starting is, in your language, perhaps, I would say you've been teaching mythopoetics for the last 45 years or longer, maybe. So where has that passion come from? We ended when you arrived at Pacifica, but why? And just one other thing I want to add on that is that one thing I've always liked about Pacifica is the multidisciplinary, and so you've kind of come from literature and depth psychology. It's the merging of those two, and it seems to me that you've spent a lifetime teaching people about mythopoetics, which we're calling today the poetic basis of the mind. But why?
Yeah. And where did that come from?
Yeah. And why do you have that passion? And why have you been teaching people for over 45 years about mythopoetics?
Yeah. Part of it is still a mystery to me. There's a room in our home. It's a guest bedroom, and it's where our cat sleeps at night, and he claims it, and that's perfectly fine. But in there are copies, multiple copies of all of the books that I've written or edited or co-authored. And John, sometimes I'll go in there to feed the cat, and I'll get his bowl down and a fresh bowl of cat food, and I'll look up at the shelves and I'll ask myself, how the hell did you do that? I don't have an answer. They came out of me at different points in my life over 30 30 some years, but to try to remember the machinations that gathered, constellated, to bring those particular essays in those volumes, Limbo of Shards being one of them, I bang up against the mystery of the self. I don't know. But what I do remember is, and I think I brought it up when we talked about a little bit of my history, I would find ways as a 10-year-old, 11-year-old to fake being sick at home so that I could stay home, build a little fort with blankets, had a little plastic radio so I could listen to Nat King Cole and the McGuire sisters. And my mother would go to the library, and she was an avid reader. And part of my love of reading was watching her loving reading.
Mm.
To get away from four boys and a girl, four boys, really, my sister saved my mother's life. All of that male raging energy because of the alcoholic father on the weekends. And she would be reading downstairs and I would be reading up, and the house was so quiet. And I'd get lost in these X-Bar X-Boys on the ranch and their adventures, or the Black Beauty series. And I thought, I love this world that I enter. And I could do that for 2, maybe I could push it to 3 days during winter snowstorms. And then I'd have to go back to the Ursuline nuns and the system. I think it began there. And part of it was very feminine or organized. No, that's not right. Feminine inspired. Yeah. And I've always had a very strong anima in me. And for years, the true friends that I had were all female.
Mm.
I just gravitated. I liked the way they spoke to each other. They spoke about things that had some depth to them.
Yeah.
Where the males that I knew, God bless them,
Usually a little bit more male ego involved, perhaps.
very male ego. Yeah. And thankfully, over the years, I've met men like
Yeah.
you and others who we can speak about depth things.
Yeah.
But I think that's the eros. That's the eros, the relationship between my wounded self and the imaginal world, that it helped me in ways that I think I was unconscious of to understand what the hell was happening to me. Yeah.
Well, there's so many places to go from all of that, Dennis. You know, one thing I think is the anima, which you just brought up. I noticed in again, you know, just going back to Hillman for 1 second, when in the essential, a blue fire, the essential James Hillman, he talks about the poetic basis of mind. He talks about literalism. You know, he wasn't a big fan of literalism, was he? And then all of a sudden it goes to the anima, to one's obsessions, one's fascinations, one's depths. I mean, could you speak a little bit about that more?
Wow. Yeah, about the anima?
Yeah, and the anima and how that's linked to the poetic basis of mind, perhaps.
Yeah, I feel the strong feminine presence in poesis, which I think I'm remembering correctly, which meant originally in the Greek a making or a shaping of something into a coherent form so that it could be shared with others. Joyce comes along with his vocabulary and his style that was not easily grasped. Melville too. I think he sold a couple of hundred copies of Moby Dick during his lifetime, and and then there was a fire in a factory and it burned all the rest of them. So he made practically nothing off of it. But the feminine, the, the, the feminine presence has a power that is so different from the masculine presence. And I think the feminine presence is closer to the self with a capital S
Yeah.
than the masculine presence, which is more active, ego-oriented, control, predictive, quantitative, more like the directed thinking over against the fantasy thinking
Yeah.
that begins to move us into the musing world, the world of the muses. Yeah.
And psychology was named after Psyche from myth, you know. So it's
Yes.
kind of like the muses, as you say, and or Psyche. So I think, you know, maybe in my shorthand, Dennis, like if one is inducted into the world, and especially if you're a young male, you know, who's into sport, and I remember playing football and all of that, and then, you know, there's that masculine intent, let's say.
Yeah.
And I remember first meditating, which was like very soft and just dropping some of that perhaps armor. And it was like into that world of depth, you know. It was, I realized how much kind of armor had been there, you know, when I had that first experience in meditation. It's something like that, isn't it? It's like they're all linked. The psyche, depth, the feminine, anima.
Yeah. That's what Pema Chodron, the Buddhist psychologist, comes back to again and again. One, how much longer are you going to stay in that stinking nest that makes you comfortable and get out and risk something? That's one. The other, when are you going to start taking off the layers of armor or the scaffolding that keeps you from feeling the world on any level that has significance to it? So those are two of her images.
Yeah.
And part of it is just acknowledge where you're imperfect, accept it, and move on. And I love this. It's such a simple thing. Pause and relax into it. The wretched parts of yourself and the golden parts of yourself. Don't choose one. They're both who you are. And I love thinking of her. I mean, she and Hillman really cross-fertilize in a way that, boy, if they could have ever had a conversation, because there's some religious quality, and I would even say Buddhist quality in Hillman's writing and his thinking, where he says, don't choose, face what is. I mean, that's as Buddhist a concept as one could come across, a Buddhist psychology concept. Face what is, and then ask, what do you see? Yeah, it's hard to see without the concepts, without the assumptions, without the prejudices, just to see what is. And Jim had a word for it. He called it noticia. Notice what is. Start there.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, it's brilliant in its simplicity.
I want to just add, you know, bring in a quote from Hillman, and
Good.
you quoted this in an essay that you wrote about city and soul, and it was entitled "Towards an Aesthetic Psychology."
Okay.
The word for perception or sensation in Greek was I don't know how you say this word, aesthesis, which means,
Yes.
yes, which means at root a breathing in or a taking in of the world, the gasp,
Yes.
the aha, the ah, the breath, the the breath in wonder, shock, amazement,
Yes.
an aesthetic response to the image, the eidolon, presented
Mhm.
in ancient Greek physiology and in biblical psychology. The heart was the organ of sensation, and it was also the place of imagination. So if we're talking about the poetic basis of the mind, to me, that seems like such a fabulous guts of it, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah.
Which goes back to a little of what you're saying, just the direct perception of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the aesthetic attitude for Hillman is indispensable for a poetic basis of mind to develop. And he has so many, if I can just peek here, John, on my notes, because the aesthetic attitude becomes a central place in his thinking. Why is it not showing up? Yeah. And the aesthetic attitude seems to allow one to refrain from fixing something in place, like being old means this. And then that ageism creeps in, and an older person is locked into this stereotype, and people think, now I understand what being old means. And they've never touched the character of being old, but they think they have an understanding.
Yeah.
And so it's a blindness that they think is visionary.
So we grew up on directed thinking, didn't we? Like, join the world of action.
Yep.
And you do this, you do that, you do that. You wake up in the morning, you get out of bed running, and you go for it, and you climb the ladder, so to speak.
Yes.
And then we've grown up on this kind of analysis and concepts of, the analysis from a far off distance. But this thing of going back to almost direct experience and direct knowing. And what would you say about all that? How do we do it? How do you do it?
Well, I remember in graduate school at the University of Dallas in their interdisciplinary program. So we were asked to major in an area and minor in an area. I came in majoring in phenomenological psychology, which was next to Duquesne in Pittsburgh. There were no other, there was one on the West Coast, but graduates of Duquesne started this program with Robert Romanishin and Robert Sardello and others. But when I had Louise Cowan, who was my mentor for maybe 50 years, I took her Russian novel class and realized my soul is in the poetic world, not phenomenology. So I flipped them. But the reason I'm bringing it up is in classes, we would be given an instruction like describe being caught in traffic and knowing you're going to be late for an appointment that has tremendous import for you. Describe that experience. And inevitably, not all of us, but I was one of, I immediately went to conceptualizing it. I couldn't see the experience. I couldn't get past the concept of being frustrated to describe being frustrated.
Yeah.
And so it was a tearing down
Yeah.
of that move to, while you think you're explaining it, you say, well, how did I feel?
Mm.
Well, I felt angry. And so, well, what is it to feel angry? Oh God, all right, we got it back. I mean, those really just stripped us down
Mm.
and made us conscious of how the phenomenon gets lost so easily by one's assumptions about it, by one's explanation.
Yeah.
See, explanation came in and we thought it was description. It wasn't.
Yeah.
That helped me immensely in the literature classes to stop conceptualizing the
Yeah.
poem, the tragedy of Sophocles, and enter the experience of that Oedipus is having
Yeah.
and speak from there. So again, this is Hillman. Speak from the inside out,
Yeah.
not from the outside speaking in.
Yeah.
That was hard, John, because our psyche in the culture we lived in
It's a
said,
big
go with
conditioning.
the explanation. Pardon?
It's a big conditioning, isn't it?
It's a huge conditioning, and we don't know it
Hmm.
until an alternative
Yeah.
surfaces and you think, what the hell is this?
Hmm.
And then you can crawl back into your turtle shell and say, well, it's not for me. Or I am ready for a change, and this might be the place to do it
Hmm.
through this aperture.
Hmm.
Yeah. But that was wonderful, even though I just minored in it.
Hmm.
It fed literature and phenomenology just came together like this.
Hmm.
Then Hillman came to the University of Dallas and blew phenomenology out of the water with archetypal psychology and flipped the whole program. That's when I met him.
Hmm.
When he came in 75, I think, from Zurich. Yeah, with Pat Berry. He was married to her then.
One of the things, Dennis, from what you were just saying there, is I remember a piece on he wrote about the snake, that if the snake comes in a dream and people will give the snake means this. So he went through the list of major, maybe there were 6 or 7 of them, the kind of things people will say, oh no, that's bad, the snake came or whatever. And then, of course, he's going to that other alternative of just staying with the image of the snake, the raw image of the snake, the
That's right.
experience of the snake,
Yes.
which is kind of what you were saying earlier, wasn't it?
Yes. Stay with the experience of the snake. That's hard,
Mm.
especially in a culture suffering ADD, actually global, but it's the ability to discern something, pay attention to it. And here's an example, if I can use this. This is from Hillman.
Yeah.
Anyhow, uh, I can tell you in just a second. Yeah, from The Force of Character, page 193. Hillman tells the story of a group to Greece. Debbie was a younger member, full of herself, laughing too loudly. Madame Laforge was the old scold, until Hillman noticed that she, the old scold, took her personal irritations to another level, to the cultural and important. She stood her senior ground and showed that part of that ground is aesthetic judgment. Fitness, appropriateness, sensitivity, aesthetic considerations belong as much to behavior as does finding the right word to keep the rhythm in a line of poetry. When I read
That's
that
great.
example, it helped me tremendously. He saw it one way, then he noticed, Jim. And when he noticed, he went beyond seeing to the Madame Laforge's imagination. She was standing up uh, for the importance of aesthetic judgment. Yeah, it's just beautiful.
It
Yeah.
seems that, again, just before we started, but, in the first half of life, one I mean, this is a generalization, right? One may have a certain kind of life, very busy or whatever. But as one gets older, this thing of contemplation, memory, reverie. I mean, I remember my dad, well into his 80s, and this need to tell stories and to share the images. I mean, I loved it. It was so rich. It was so beautiful what he was passing on. But
Yes.
It's something that you see, isn't it? That it's good because it's like in older age, there's a more of a porousness or a reflection or a contemplation, which is kind of natural or something. Sometimes.
It is. Yeah. Jim loves the fact he loves old people because he said they love the odd. They love the weird. And he said older people ought to be writing poetry. I love that. Not drawing up and reading the newspaper and checking the obituaries, but writing, first of all, maybe reading poetry, but also writing poetry because of reasons that you just named. So Sandy and I have been married for 56 years. We'll go out to our favorite Mexican restaurant during the week because the margaritas are half price and have a meal. And
so there still is a bit of directed thinking in there, Dennis. There's a little bit of
yeah, otherwise I couldn't get the damn car out of the garage. And so we'll go and she'll say something about, do you remember when we were in Ireland in April? Or do you remember when we were living in Rome teaching for the University of Dallas? And I started to take this school car out with Matt, who was then 4, into town. She didn't know the language. And she just said, I'm conquering Rome. And I said, no, I don't remember you doing that. I was in part directing the program and teaching. My head was full of 111, 115 sophomores with, their libido all over the place, like good Catholic youth that they were. So,
like Rome itself, I would say too. Yeah. That's a good definition of Rome. Libido all over the place.
Rome, the libidinal city. That's right. But John, it is so enjoyable to be with this woman who I've grown up with, and we shared all these experiences and the birth of 2 sons, and then now at our age, just remembering. But it's more than remembering.
Yeah,
it's imagining
it's
another.
It's mythic because it's about story and about one's myth in the world and one's place in the world, and so much more is coming into it, isn't it? Yes. I mean, I guess again, in a very concrete society, success-oriented society, it's seen as somehow lesser reverie or story or contemplation, but the richness, we need to know how much richness, and sometimes I think of the word metaxy, the middle ground.
Yeah.
But
yes,
the soul as between the body and the beyond. That we need some of the beyond.
Yes. Somewhere Jim talks about that. The soul at its best occupies that middle space and can kind of stay fluid and move back and forth in time and in space. And what this helped me in reading, because I went to Myth of Analysis, I went to The Force of Character, because I started to, I'd go to the index and see the pages that say poetry, and then I'd go to them, and I started to just muse over what he said about poetry, and in the creases was this poetic basis of mind that just kept emerging. And so I came at it at a little bit different direction.
Yeah.
I read a chapter in archetypal psychology on poetic basis of mind, but I felt a compulsion to try to add something to it, not just Xerox him.
Yeah, of course.
You know, I mean,
I
but
think
also,
you're, from reading a Limbo, I'm butting in a little bit, Dennis, but from
no, go
reading
ahead.
a Limbo of Shards is that I think what you're really bringing in there is this knowing that comes, um, the knowing of language, the gnosis, the gnosis of the poetic, the deep knowing. It seems to me that's what you're bringing a lot of there.
Yes, gnosis, the knowing, and eros, the loving. And Dante had a term for it. And I think Jim loved Dante's world. I believe Florence gave Jim the keys to the city of Florence
Yeah,
for his work at one point.
yeah.
But Dante's term was intelletto de amore, the intelligence of love. That's in the one of the sonnets in La Vita Nuova. And Dante, in writing these, I think there's 44 sonnets that comprise La Vita Nuova, and he wrote one that began La Donne Intelletto d'Amore, the the ladies who have intelligence of love. He saw that as a feminine quality,
Mm,
and he felt that the ladies would understand his sonnets,
mm,
not a male audience.
mm.
So he was onto it. I think he was onto this kind of feminine knowing that that suggests that one let's see that the intelligence that the intellect that no that love has an intellect. That's what I wanted to say. Love has an intellect. Love knows in a way that no other form knows in
Yeah,
that way.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Sorry, I was just trying
That
to get
that's
my thoughts
that's
together.
the heart, the knowing of the heart
The
as
heart.
well. Like this is what's been inferiorized, and this is what we're trying to. This is what's been repressed, and this is what we're trying to awaken. But I think there's one other really important point in all of this is that how important this whole process is, uh, because there's always that thing about art and uh, uh, whether like is art just for the few, and but the
Yes.
way I see the poetic mind is it's for all of it, and that
Yeah.
okay, there might be a Dante or I mean, I think what a lot of us maybe sometimes come across is if you're into writing or art or painting or whatever, is the lack of utility of it. But on the same hand, just the total need for it, regardless of one's, uh, artistic capability in the eyes of the world, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Reading him helped me understand why Francis Yates' book, The Art of Memory, was so important to Jim because he saw, oh, I typed something up here, but it's at the top of the page. Let me see if I can just find it real quickly. Yeah. The the exact methods show care. That's another key term in this poetic basis of mind. Being careful, caring for, uh, uh, having a caring heart. For the thesaurus of Memoria, which he says is the storehouse of the imaginal. So exact methods show care for the thesaurus of Memoria, the storehouse of the imaginal. And I wrote to myself, here you see why Francis Yates, The Art of Memory, was so important to him. because memory is the storehouse of the imaginal. What a rich image that is. And that storehouse is just, it's infinite.
And that's also like the elders and the ancestors, because they're the storehouse, you know.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. When Telemachus is sent out, guided by Athena, to leave home, he's now about 19. The first place she says to him to go to, and she accompanies him, is to the land of Nestor, who is the elder, and he has the long story,
Right.
and he can fill in for Telemachus like the epic story of his father, because he fought with him. And then from Nestor, Athena tells him, now go to the house of Helen and Menelaus, because he's the last one to have seen your father alive. So first the long story to fill in this naive kind of blank slate of a son, and then the short story that in miniature duplicates the 10 years Odysseus spends getting home. I think Menelaus spends a year getting home, but he's the precursor, the prototype for Odysseus on his way home. Yeah, it's a Homer's brilliance in really, first you've got to have the survey, then come to the particulars. Menelaus talks about fighting next to his father and the spears that his father used, and all that rich detail. But Nestor gives the long story. Yeah, I just think Homer's brilliance about how we learn, and there's an order to how we should learn.
Yeah, that's good.
I kind of like survey courses in college, literature survey courses, but I wish I'd had that sense of the Odyssey where I could really appreciate, well, the survey course is giving you the long story with all these different chapters, different authors, and then you specialized in junior and senior classes where maybe you take a course in Milton or a course in Dostoevsky and you bear down on one writer. So there was a wisdom there that I never saw, but I followed it. Yeah.
And Dennis, I've got one or two things to ask you before we go. I'm not sure how you say the word, the muse of sacred poetry, polyhymnia.
Polyhymnia.
I've heard of Clio as one of the muses, and she's quite popular, but polyhymnia, can you tell us a little bit about her?
I'm going to see if I can recall. I think Cleo is the muse of history.
History, yeah.
If I'm remembering.
Which is a little bit about what you were talking about just prior as well.
Yes. Yeah. John, I don't have her ready at hand.
Right. I like that idea that there's the muse of sacred poetry, and what you had this in one of your essays, Dennis, and it reminded me. I was thinking of like this whole thing of singing that you sometimes get. I got in a dream once of the singing, and the again, it's this ancestry, the beginning of the word, the singing, the sacred word. The in the beginning there was the word somehow, and that's something like beautiful to tap into.
Absolutely, and the importance of naming things has always fascinated me. I mean, so if we stay with the story as a metaphor, the Genesis, God creates the world, but he gives Adam at least, and there's so much stuff to unravel there, but he gives him like the second most important thing to do, and that's name the things created.
Right.
Well, there's tremendous power in that. and authority.
Mm.
I remember talking to Pat Hillman, yeah, at the Dallas Institute decades ago. And she, of course, was a therapist, and she and Jim were still married in Dallas and so forth. But I asked her about different, what's the value of diagnosis? Something like that. I'm trying to call this up from like 40 years ago.
Yeah.
But I remember her, she said, when you can name something, it can take a lot of the terror or the fear out of it because now you have a word for it. And I thought that, as a therapist, I bet she was damn good at what she did because she understood there's no, if you diagnose and name it and say, now, go read about it, well, then you've got some impoverished therapist. But just, I know even with illnesses, when I had an infectious blood disease and I thought I was going to die from it. And then it was named by an infectious disease doctor. And I thought, thank God. Now I know I don't have some exotic thing for which there's no antibiotic
From an
store
unknown. Yeah.
from an unknown. He said, now that we've named it, we know the antibiotic that works on this. And it was like, I think I'm going to live. But it was powerful.
Didn't Hillman say something along the line, words are like animals or something, but this idea that they have a life of their own, but also on the other side, like in the diagnosis, and where perhaps that can be a double-edged sword sometimes because it can also be something to carry, but
That's right.
because of the power of the words or whatever. But just, again, if I think of Jung, he said he put his hat into the stream and took something from the stream or whatever. The poetic, there's power in the words because it seems to me that from a young person who doesn't have a lot of language to talk about these deep inner processes, feelings, myths, emotions, that these poetic images can just catch deep parts of that journey.
Yes. I remember reading Jung in Memory's Dreams, where he was working with a woman, and she was she was fiercely neurotic. She wasn't psychotic, but pretty illiterate. And Jung realized she knows nothing about myths, so I'm hamstrung. I don't know if I can help her because she's mythically barren. Yeah. And he said, I can't revert to mythic figures to help her find analogies for what she's suffering. And he said, I felt helpless. And so, I mean, you think of the implications of that, John.
For our own education.
Yeah.
Whether that education is autodidactic or whatever, but it's like the need to bring in myth as foundational reference. Because I feel that we can fall into slogan if there's not myth,
Exactly right. And the two figures that I want to mention here before we finish, and was part of our conversation last night. Ahab is the fixed, frozen consciousness, held paralyzed by his wound and his resentment. He can't budge. Ishmael carries that poetic basis of mind because he sees analogies everywhere. And as you keep reading, and we're seeing the story through Ishmael's narrative skills, you get the sense he is showing us how fundamentally everything is related to everything else.
Yeah.
Nothing escapes that entanglement.
Yeah.
And for many in the class, that was so revelatory and so pleasing.
Yeah.
Because they were seeing the imagination at work, connecting, finding a historical antecedent, bringing in a myth from Egypt.
And all the gods are together, you know.
And all the gods are together.
Apollo and Hera and Dionysus and, you know, Aphrodite, like they're not just alone, or they're not just one by themselves.
No, they're constellated. Yeah.
I think that's a lovely place to finish, Dennis, unless you've got.
Okay. No, that's, I mean, it's just, this has been really, really rich.